Welcome to 3 tips to protect yourself, your family, and your assets. Do you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes worried that you haven't protected your money, that somehow it's threatened by lawsuits or governmental actions or taxes or matters such as those? Or you haven't really protected yourself or your family. You're worried about your own personal safety or your health. Or you're not really planning, or you haven't planned well enough to protect your future or your family's future, your kids going to college, that next chapter of life called retirement. If you're worried about any of these things, you've come to the right place, because we're going to try to give you some help today. And how we're going to do that is we're going to really begin by looking at what I call 7 categories of chaos creationists today in our webinar. But first, let me introduce myself to you. My name's Michael A. Babiars. I'm a retired attorney, and I spent 25 plus years in the suburbs of Chicago in private practice, where I owned my own firm, and I concentrated in the areas of asset protection planning, estate administration, elder law, corporate and business transactions. And during the time I was in private practice and continuing thereafter, I did a lot of teaching. I was an adjunct professor at a local college. I created and taught adult education classes. I was an invited speaker between groups of various sizes. And I still create and teach classes to this very day for private schools and for corporations. And although I don't practice law anymore and don't give individual legal advice, I can still teach. I can still draw upon my background to try to help folks, to try to help individuals understand, to try to educate people in what are sometimes very, very complex issues. And so what we're doing in today's webinar isn't going to give you any kind of legal, financial, accounting, or other professional advice. I hope it will provide you with some significant education and information to help you as you move forward in trying to protect yourself and your family and your assets. So let's jump right in, because I promised you 3 tips. And let's lead off with the first tip. And this one I draw from that boot camp of the mind experience called law school. Yes, I did go to law school. It was about 1,000 years ago. Just joking, of course. But one of the things that is a misconception about law school is that it's going to teach you the law. Oh no, it teaches you very little of the law, because the law is enormous. There is no way that 3 years of schooling could teach people, quote unquote, the law. What it really teaches you is how to use your mind differently. And what I'm applying from that law school experience, and again, you use this in your years of practice as a lawyer, and taking it and putting it into this context, is when you're trying to figure out how to protect your assets, you need to think a little bit like a lawyer or a law student. You need to make what I call intelligent inquiry. What does that mean? It means you're never going to know all the answers. You're never going to find any presentation, any book, any seminar, any video, any blog post that's going to give you the definitive list of answers for anything. But what you can hope to do is understand how to ask the right questions. Because if you know what questions to ask, you can find the answers that you need. And one of the keys to knowing what the questions are that you need to ask is to do what lawyers like to call, and law students, issue spotting. You have to know the issue of what is at hand, what it is you are trying to understand more about. So when we look at our 7 categories of chaos creationists, what we're really doing today is giving you some issues to look at and apply to your current situation. So what I would encourage you to do is, as we're going through these categories, is to make your own intelligent inquiry. Try to ask yourself the questions of how this applies to your situation. Is this present in my family? Do I have this in the way I've set up my assets? Because if you know the right questions to ask, you will be able to start crafting that plan to move forward and protect yourself, your family, and your assets. So let's jump right in. My first category deals with kind of natural or unnatural disasters, and a lot of these you're going to be somewhat familiar with. Fire, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, blizzards, all kinds of weather events, lightning strikes even. Another more subtle one is your home sometimes can be your own worst enemy. We've had stories of children being poisoned by looking at the, wrong chemicals under the sink, or people falling in their home and being seriously injured or even passing away because of that. Yes, your home can kill you. And so one of the things you have to do is be aware of your surroundings and be aware of the world around you. And when you're aware of the world around you, I don't need to say much more about our second issue. We do live in unique times, and we have to have an awareness of the times in which we live. And of course, our third item here on the list is one that was sort of an unwelcome guest at the beginning of 2020, and it's a word that's now a part of all of our vocabularies. And pandemics, and the current pandemic from COVID has been one that has caused significant challenges to personal and family well-being and to assets. And finally, well, maybe this one may not be such a big deal, but nonetheless, we got to have a little bit of fun with this, because if we don't want this to all be gloom and doom, of course. Now, another area where we find significant challenges to the well-being of ourselves, our family, and our assets is health matters. And yeah, there still are people that don't have medical insurance, or even if people have medical insurance, there's still medical expenses that aren't paid for, and they can become very significant. But worse yet, you can sometimes have the loss of income from a health event. If the main or one of the primary breadwinners of the family winds up being the one that's significantly ill and out of commission for a while, you can lose income. Many families now rely upon double incomes, and even if you're a single individual, you have an even perhaps more profound problem. And if you're married or in a partnership type relationship, maybe your spouse or your partner needs to care for you. So we can have loss of income from both sides. And worst of all in this category is long-term care. You may be preparing for that happy day when you retire and enter that next chapter of your life, only to find that a health event befalls you or your spouse or your partner, and someone in the household needs long-term care in a nursing home. And this can be a significant threat to your assets, a significant stressor in your life, because there are several ways that long-term care is paid for, but the ones you might think of off the top of your head are not significant players. You might think, oh, I've got private insurance, health insurance, or I've got Medicare. Medicare and normal private health insurance pays for very little in the long-term care arena. There is insurance for it, but most of us don't buy it. There's long-term care insurance. You probably don't have that. You may think about it at some point as part of your strategic plan. So you're left with either private pay, which means that 5 to 10 grand a month that nursing home costs, and yes, 5 figures is not uncommon in certain areas of the country. That's going to come out of your assets and maybe leave your family with less than an optimal situation. Or you might be looking at the Medicaid system. And don't confuse Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is that federal insurance program. Medicaid is that combined federal state welfare program. And yes, you need to become eligible for Medicaid, but there are ways you can do that legally and legitimately within the law. But you need to first be aware of and issue spot the whole concept and the whole dilemma of long-term care. That needs to be in your consciousness because that is the single biggest health-related monetary threat that many of us face, and it may be the single biggest expenditure anyone makes in their lifetime. And then there's just straight up money woes. We mentioned in our second event, our chaos creationist, as being health problems. Health problems are one of the leading causes of bankruptcy filings. I mean, one of the ways we can figure out what the real money woes are in this country is to look what causes people to go to the ultimate relief from their financial woes, and that's bankruptcy. And yeah, health woes are really high up on that list. Job losses are high up on that list too. Most of us don't have more than a few weeks worth of bills that we can pay from our savings. We live mostly paycheck to paycheck. Lawsuits. Now here's something a lot of folks may not think about, but we do live in a litigious society. One of the great things about living in America is there's a lot of freedom. One of the downsides to that freedom is we allow people to get redress from the courts if they feel they've been wronged in some way. And so there's a perception that maybe America is overly litigious. I'll leave that policy argument for another day, but you need to be aware of lawsuits and what you're doing in your current activities that might make you more exposed to lawsuits. Now, here's what most people think leads to the number one cause of bankruptcy, and they think, it's just people being irresponsible and running up credit card debt. Well, debts do lead to bankruptcies, but it isn't the top or the number one or two cause. It is, irresponsibility does lead to some bankruptcies, but sometimes credit card debt gets run up because you lost your job, or you had a health event, or you got sued by somebody. So a lot of these things can interrelate and intertwine. Now here's a very subtle one you may not be aware of. More and more of us now are no longer employees. Yes, we have our traditional entrepreneur, the person that is aware that they own a business and run a business. But are you a gig worker? Because if you're a gig worker, you're in business for yourself. How do you know if you're a gig worker? Well, an employee gets a check periodically, and from that check, their employer is taking out taxes. A gig worker will get paid periodically from the person they contract with, but there's no taxes taken out. And at the end of the year, they'll get a 1099, and they should have been making quarterly installments of estimated taxes, and then they'll have to square up with the IRS at the end of the year. You're a gig worker if that's you. And if you're a gig worker, have you protected yourself from the issues of working for only one contracted company? Because in its worst incarnation, what I call the big contract is akin to having a job, because you only really work for one firm, but you don't have the protections of having a job. You don't have health insurance. You don't have sick days. You don't have vacation days. You don't have a retirement plan. You don't have a 401k plan. And you may not even get unemployment compensation if you get terminated, which you can which can happen to you on a moment's notice. Or maybe you are an entrepreneur of sorts and you sell things through one of the big platforms. Maybe you sell products or write books or do things like that, and you sell them through one of the bigger outfits that let you set up your own online store. Be aware that if you violate one of the rules of the big platform, your business could be closed down in a nanosecond. So you need to be aware of the issues surrounding that and how you could protect yourself from that. And finally, you may be taking on a whole new set of problems if you're a gig worker, or obviously if you're a traditional entrepreneur, because you're a businessman and people could sue you in your capacity in running your business. Because the bottom line here is you are an entrepreneur. If you're a gig worker, or maybe you do something on the side for extra money, and I would hazard a guess to say this is more than 50% of us now. It's my own gut instinct. But I think there's less and less of us that are traditional employees, more gig workers, and lots of folks doing businesses on the side, in addition to the traditional business and entrepreneurship that we have and is such a big part of America's history. So if you're an entrepreneur, or if you could be an entrepreneur, and that's a key distinction or a key question to ask yourself. It's a key intelligent inquiry to make. Because my second tip here is all about shifting a mindset, shifting your mindset. Because you have to ask yourself a question, and that is, are you an entrepreneur? Because if you're a gig worker, the answer is yes. If you have a business that you do even in addition to your regular job, the answer may be yes. And so if you're an entrepreneur, you need to take advantage of the asset protection possibilities that open up by the fact that you run your own business, but you need to act like you're running your own business. Because you can protect yourself and protect your personal assets from your business issues, but you need to act like a business. So if you're a gig worker or someone with a small business, do you have a corporation? Do you have an LLC that you do business under? You know, these are maybe questions that you need to ask yourself as you perform that mindset shift. I have to be very careful how I say that phrase because you can say it wrong. And all of a sudden this presentation isn't PG rated anymore. But shifting that mindset is a key and a second tip for how you can start crafting that asset protection plan for yourself. Well, are you anxious to know more about this? If you are, take a peek below in the description because it contains information about a course that I actually crafted and presented called Protect Yourself and Your Assets, which goes much more in depth in a lot of these issues and many more. And there's a special offer available now on it. With this class, you get the equivalent of 8 50-minute college classes. I mean, there's 8 50-minute sessions here. We've got a workbook with exercises and a lot of tools and instruction for you to start crafting your own strategic plan about how to protect yourself, your family, and your assets. Now, our fourth of our 7 areas here deals with a lot of interesting issues, ones that have become more challenging in today's world because it seems like our privacy is getting invaded more and more, isn't it? Whether it's, cameras everywhere on the street, in every store, in every building you walk into, intrusions into your physical privacy, your information, your private information, and how you protect your private information from that type of problem. And finally, protecting yourself from people saying, not only just using your private information or using private true, but maybe embarrassing things about you, but also saying false things about you. And the law calls that defamation. Defamation's got 2 different elements to it. Slander is oral. If somebody says something about you that's not true, they are slandering you potentially. If they do it in writing in some form, it's called libel. But both libel and slander are forms of defamation, fake things about you. And in today's digital world, my goodness, there can be a lot of problems with that, not only with you personally, but if you do own a business or are an entrepreneur, you have to be vigilant about protecting your business's reputation, because if you lose your reputation, personal or business, you're in a world of hurt, personally, family-wise, and maybe even income or asset-wise. So it's a key issue, a key area into which you need to make those inquiries, those intelligent inquiries. Identity theft is another thing that grows out of the whole concept of protecting your private information. It's sort of our 5th issue is sort of an outgrowth of our 4th one. And many people think of identity theft as someone jumping on your identity to try to gain credit. They're going to take out loans in your name. And yes, identity thieves do that. But it's more than money that's at stake here, it's your life. They're really jumping on your persona in many creative ways. For example, a lot of identity thieves will, yes, they'll use your identity to obtain credit. They may even get a cosmetic medical procedure under your name. They might file bogus insurance claims under your name. They might even commit crimes pretending to be you. And one of the things you may think is, well, if you go through this process, and let me tell you, I've known people that have had their identity stolen, and it is years to put out all the brush fires from the main conflagration that is the theft of your identity. And you might think, oh my gosh, if only you start wishing you were dead, and then this thing would all be over. Wrong. Sometimes people jump on the identities of dead people. Now, I mentioned it before, I did estate administration, and although I was fortunate never to have a decedent's estate in which I worked or on which I worked, where there was an identity theft, I knew of it from colleagues, and it's a mess. It's a problem. People do jump on the identity of someone that has died and continue to use their credit and their identity to do things. And finally, if you're someone that's a creative, you write books, you perform or write music, your intellectual property is very, very hard to protect these days. And that's really a part of yourself, isn't it? When I've talked to so many creatives, the musician who writes the song, the author who writes the book, they're passionate about what they do. They put a lot of themselves into what they've created. And when someone steals that, it's almost as if they're stealing a part of that person. And this is really something that it's much more difficult to protect in today's world, but it should be part of your strategic plan if you're creative. It should be part of your inquiries you're making. It should be part of your business, your entrepreneurial journey. If you're an author or a musician, you are an entrepreneur. And remember, if you need to know more, you want to go in depth, or just whetting your appetite perhaps a little bit in this arena, there is that full course out there that you can sign up for. Protect yourself and your assets. You get the 8 sessions, the workbook, and a lot more in-depth into not only these issues, but others, about the whole area of protecting your assets, your family, and yourself. I'm going to segue into some happy things now, or happy for many folks. Are you going to relocate, or have you just relocated? Maybe you moved across town, down the block, cross country, or across the world. Yes, it can be a happy time. It can be an exciting time. It can be a stressful time. It can be a threatening time. There are so many factors that play into relocation that pose significant threats to your assets and to your family. Retirement, I spoke about it a little bit earlier. One of the significant threats to that is long-term care, but many of us are ill prepared for the day when that next chapter of our life comes to play. And so there's a lot of digging and inquiry that needs to be had to know how you can protect yourself, your family, your assets when retirement is on your horizon, and it's on everyone's horizon. It's just how long that time frame is. And then there's a third area which I've euphemistically named rebirth. And this is oftentimes a profound and sometimes very, very joyful time in someone's life. We all know stories of people that have had spiritual or religious awakenings, or someone that's gone through a 12-step program and changed their life totally, or someone that's had a philosophical reawakening. And these can be wonderful, wonderful things for many folks, but they can also be stressful. They can also present challenges. They can also present threats, yes, threats to you, your family structure, and your assets as well. And finally, you may think that the number one ally you have in protecting your world is your family. And you'd be right. Your family can be your number one ally, but unfortunately, family members can also be your number one adversary. There can be a lot of issues that arise in family situations. And this is a tough one because you have to really view your own situation dispassionately. When you're making that intelligent inquiry into this area of your life, you got to set aside sentiment. It really has to be done very, very hard-nosed. Pretend you're a lawyer looking at a family other than your own. How would you view this? Take yourself out of the situation and look at it from perhaps a third person standpoint. Because there's lots of things that come up in family situations: divorces, marriages, reconciliations, birth of children, birth of grandchildren, death or disability of family members, even boomerang children, the kids that leave home and then they wind up coming back to live with their parents because they can't make it on their own anymore. And yeah, you did keep their room the same way. They still have the cartoon sheets on the bed and the pictures of the boy bands on the walls. And then blended families are sometimes a very joyful thing. Step parenting, step kids can be great. It can also be a fountain of foibles, because you may have four sets of parents involved here. You could have stepmom, stepdad, biological mom, biological dad, and there's a lot of different dynamics that come into play here. And this leads me to my third tip in our 3 tips today that we're giving you, and that is sometimes even happy times can create chaos. I mean, it's sad to say, but with change, oftentimes there's challenge. Retirement, blending a family, relocating. These can all be really exciting and happy times, but they can be challenging and they can be even threatening times. Because times of change mean you have to reassess your plans. You have to look at your strategies. You have to look at what you've set forth for how to make sure that you, your family, and your assets are well cared for. So I hope that today our 3 tips to protect yourself, your family, and your assets was helpful to you. Again, we looked at making intelligent inquiry into all areas of your life, and I hope the 7 areas I gave you today at least gave you a start. And if you are an entrepreneur, or could be, that's a key mindset shift for you, and also a key area in which you can add additional asset and personal protection for yourself. And finally, remember, all the joyous times sometimes can be challenging as well. It's not always the good times that don't always, can sometimes also have their downsides along with them. Well, and I'd like to thank you for joining me today. I hope this was helpful to you. And again, if you want to go more in depth, not only on these issues, but others, many others, we've got a course available for you, Protect Yourself and Your Assets, with sessions, workbooks, tools, instructions, exercises for you to create your strategic plan to how to protect yourself, your family, and your assets. Thanks so much for joining me today.